Based on the transcript from the interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin, I've analyzed the content for potential false statements, exaggerations, or misleading claims made by Putin. Here's a detailed breakdown. Claim: NATO's promise not to expand eastward. Putin's statement: Putin repeatedly claims that NATO promised not to expand eastward after the dissolution of the Soviet Union, but this promise was broken. Reality check. This is a frequently cited grievance by Putin, but the reality is more nuanced. There is no written, legally binding agreement that NATO would not expand eastward. While there were discussions during German reunification talks about NATO's presence in Eastern Europe, these were not formalized into any kind of binding agreement. The expansion of NATO to include Eastern European countries was driven largely by those countries' own requests to join, rather than NATO's aggressive expansion. Claim: Ukraine is an artificial state. Putin's statement: Putin suggests that Ukraine is an artificial state created by the Soviet Union, implying that it lacks legitimate sovereignty. Reality check. This is a deeply flawed and historically inaccurate assertion. Ukraine has a long history as a distinct cultural and political entity with its own language and national identity. While the borders of modern Ukraine were shaped by historical events, including Soviet policies, the idea that Ukraine is merely an artificial creation undermines the country's long-standing history and the legitimate aspirations of its people for self-determination. Claim: Ukraine's 2014 revolution was a coup. Putin's statement: Putin repeatedly refers to Ukraine's 2014 revolution as a coup backed by the West, particularly the United States. Reality check. The 2014 revolution in Ukraine, also known as the Euromaidan, was largely a popular uprising against the then-President Yanukovych after he refused to sign an association agreement with the European Union. While it's true that Western countries supported the pro-democracy movements in Ukraine, calling it a coup ignores the broad-based popular support for change in Ukraine and oversimplifies the complex political dynamics at play. Claim: the West supports neo-Nazism in Ukraine. Putin's statement: Putin alleges that Ukraine is overrun with neo-Nazis and that the West supports these elements. Reality check. This claim is part of the Russian narrative used to justify its actions in Ukraine. While there are far-right groups in Ukraine, as there are in many countries, the idea that Ukraine is controlled by neo-Nazis or that the West supports such elements is a gross exaggeration. The Ukrainian government, led by President Zelensky, who is Jewish, does not espouse neo-Nazi ideology. This narrative has been widely debunked by independent analysts and organizations. Claim: Russia's annexation of Crimea was a defensive measure. Putin's statement: Putin justifies the annexation of Crimea by claiming it was necessary to protect the Russian-speaking population and that it was a response to Western actions. Reality check. The annexation of Crimea in 2014 was widely condemned as a violation of international law. The referendum held in Crimea under Russian military occupation has been criticized for not meeting democratic standards. The annexation is seen by most of the international community as an illegal act of aggression rather than a defensive measure. Claim: Russia did not start the war in 2022. Putin's statement: Putin claims that Russia did not start the war in 2022, but is trying to end it, portraying Russia as reacting to Western provocations. Reality check. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022 was an unprovoked act of aggression. While Putin frames it as a response to Western actions, the invasion was a clear violation of Ukraine's sovereignty and has been condemned globally. The war was initiated by Russia, not the West. Claim: the West controls global media. Putin's statement: Putin suggests that the West controls global media and uses it to suppress alternative narratives, particularly about issues like the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. Reality check. While Western media outlets do have significant influence, the claim that they can completely control global media is an oversimplification. There are numerous independent media outlets worldwide, including many that are critical of Western policies. The Nord Stream incident remains under investigation with various theories, but no conclusive evidence publicly linking any specific actor to the event. Claim: the US dollar's decline. Putin's statement: Putin argues that the US dollar is losing its status as the world's reserve currency due to the strategic mistakes of the US. Reality check. While there are challenges to the US dollar's dominance, it remains the world's primary reserve currency. Claims of its imminent decline are often overstated, and the dollar's position is supported by the strength and size of the US economy, as well as the global financial system's reliance on the dollar. Claim: Russia's hypersonic weapons are unmatched. Putin's statement: Putin boasts that Russia is ahead of everyone in the world in terms of hypersonic offensive systems, implying a significant strategic advantage over other countries, including the US and NATO. Reality check. While Russia has developed hypersonic weapons and has made significant advances in this area, the claim that they are unmatched is an exaggeration. The United States, China, and other countries are also developing hypersonic technologies. The strategic implications of hypersonic weapons are still being debated, and while they are a concern, the notion of Russia having a definitive insurmountable advantage is not accurate. Claim: the U.S. funded terrorism in the Northern Caucasus. Putin's statement: Putin claims that the U.S. provided support to terrorist groups in the Northern Caucasus during the conflicts there, specifically accusing them of backing separatists and terrorists. Reality check. This is a serious accusation, and while the U.S. has indeed been involved in various global conflicts, there is no credible evidence to support the claim that the U.S. directly funded or supported terrorist groups in the Northern Caucasus. This region, which includes Chechnya, has been the site of brutal conflicts, but attributing U.S. support to the terrorists there is part of a broader narrative used by the Russian government to frame Western countries as hostile actors. Claim: Russia is only defending itself against NATO encroachment. Putin's statement: Putin often frames Russia's actions as purely defensive, responding to NATO's encroachment towards Russia's borders. Reality check. While NATO's expansion has been a contentious issue, the portrayal of Russia's actions as purely defensive ignores the aggressive nature of its foreign policy under Putin, particularly towards its neighbors. The annexation of Crimea, the invasion of Ukraine, and support for separatists in various regions are examples of Russia of asserting its influence aggressively rather than simply defending itself. Claim: the Minsk agreements were sabotaged by Ukraine and the West. Putin's statement: Putin claims that the Minsk agreements, which were supposed to provide a framework for peace in eastern Ukraine, were sabotaged by Ukraine and its Western allies, implying that Russia was committed to peace but was thwarted. Reality check. The Minsk agreements were indeed difficult to implement and were subject to violations by both sides. However, Russia's role in supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine and its refusal to acknowledge Ukraine's sovereignty over the region were major obstacles to peace. The narrative that Ukraine and the West alone are to blame is misleading and omits Russia's significant role in undermining the agreements. Claim: Ukraine's government is controlled by the West. Putin's statement: Putin suggests that Ukraine is essentially a puppet state controlled by the West, particularly the United States, which dictates its policies and actions. Reality check. While Ukraine has received substantial support from Western countries, particularly after the 2014 revolution and the subsequent Russian aggression, the idea that it is merely a puppet of the West is an oversimplification. Ukraine has its own government, elected by its people, and while it aligns with the West due to the Russian threat, this does not mean it lacks sovereignty or independent decision-making capacity. Claim: the Ukrainian government is full of neo-Nazis. Putin's statement: Putin frequently references the presence of neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine, using this as a justification for Russia's military actions. Reality check. While it is true that there are far-right groups in Ukraine, as there are in many countries, the characterization of the Ukrainian government as being dominated by neo-Nazis is false. President Zelensky himself is Jewish, and the far-right elements, while concerning, are not representative of the Ukrainian government or its policies. This narrative is used by Putin to delegitimize Ukraine's government and justify Russian aggression. Claim: Russia had no choice but to annex Crimea. Putin's statement: Putin presents the annexation of Crimea as a necessary action to protect Russian speakers and to prevent NATO from gaining a foothold there. Reality check. The annexation of Crimea was a violation of international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. While Putin claims it was a defensive move, it was widely condemned as an act of aggression. The presence of Russian speakers in Crimea does not justify the annexation, and the fear of NATO expansion does not legitimize this breach of international norms. Claim: the West is deliberately weakening Russia. Putin's statement: Putin suggests that the West, particularly the US, is actively trying to weaken Russia through sanctions, military support to Ukraine, and other measures. Reality check. While Western countries have imposed sanctions and provided military support to Ukraine in response to Russian actions, these measures are reactions to Russia's behavior rather than an overarching strategy to weaken Russia. The West's actions are intended to deter further aggression and to uphold international law, rather than to systematically weaken Russia as a nation. Claim: Western media controls global narratives. Putin's statement: Putin argues that Western media control global narratives, particularly regarding events like the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. Reality check. While Western media are influential, the idea that they completely control global narratives is an exaggeration. There are many independent media outlets around the world, and with the rise of social media and alternative platforms, diverse viewpoints are accessible. The claim oversimplifies the media landscape and ignores the presence of non-Western media that also shape global narratives. Claim: Germany's silence on Nord Stream reflects submission to the West. Putin's statement: Putin implies that Germany's lack of vocal opposition to the Nord Stream pipeline sabotage is because its government is subservient to Western interests rather than its own national interests. Reality check. Germany's response to the Nord Stream incident is complex and influenced by multiple factors, including diplomatic considerations, energy policies, and its relationship with other EU and NATO countries. While Germany's leadership may be cautious in its public statements, it is a stretch to claim that this is purely due to submission to Western powers. The situation is likely more about balancing various strategic interests. Summary. The interview between Tucker Carlson and Vladimir Putin is a clear demonstration of how Putin attempts to manipulate historical narratives and present a version of events that justifies Russia's actions while casting the West as the aggressor. Throughout the conversation, Putin repeatedly distorts facts, selectively omits context, and frames Russia as a victim of Western encroachment. One of the central themes Putin pushes is the idea that NATO's expansion and the West's actions have forced Russia into a defensive position. He argues that NATO broke a promise not to expand eastward, using this as a justification for Russia's aggressive actions in Ukraine and other neighboring countries. However, this narrative ignores the agency of the countries that joined NATO. They sought membership out of a desire for security and independence from Russian influence, not because of Western manipulation. The claim of a NATO promise is also misleading. There was no formal agreement to halt expansion, and the decision to expand was driven by the sovereign choices of the Eastern European nations themselves. Putin also attempts to delegitimize Ukraine as a sovereign state, calling it an artificial state and downplaying its right to exist independently from Russia. This is a gross misrepresentation of Ukraine's history and identity. Ukraine has a long history of statehood, culture, and national identity that predates Soviet influence. By suggesting that Ukraine is merely an extension of Russia, Putin ignores the legitimate aspirations of the Ukrainian people and their right to self-determination. Furthermore, Putin's discussion of Ukraine's 2014 revolution as a coup orchestrated by the West is another example of his distorted narrative. The revolution was largely a response to the corruption and authoritarianism of the Yanukovych regime, and while Western countries supported democratic movements, it was primarily a Ukrainian-led uprising. Putin's portrayal of this event as a Western conspiracy is an attempt to undermine the legitimacy of Ukraine's current government and justify Russia's subsequent actions, including the annexation of Crimea and the support for separatists in eastern Ukraine. Putin also tries to paint Russia's actions as a necessary response to Western aggression, particularly regarding NATO's influence and the perceived threat to Russian security. However, this ignores the fact that Russia has often acted as the aggressor in the region, not the defender. The invasion of Ukraine in 2022 was an unprovoked act of aggression that violated international law and Ukraine's sovereignty. Putin's rhetoric about protecting Russian speakers and fighting neo-Nazis in Ukraine is largely propaganda, designed to justify actions that are fundamentally about maintaining and expanding Russian influence. The West's response to Russia's actions has been grounded in the defense of international norms, the protection of sovereign states, and the promotion of democracy. Sanctions and support for Ukraine are not about weakening Russia, but about upholding the principles of international law and preventing further aggression. The West's actions are legitimate responses to a clear violation of these principles by Russia. In summary, Putin's narrative is constructed to justify Russia's actions and present the West as the villain. However, when examined closely, his arguments are based on distortions, selective history, and propaganda. The West's response, in contrast, is rooted in the defense of sovereignty, the rule of law, and the support of nations' rights to self-determination. These principles are the cornerstone of the international order, and it is these principles that are being defended in the face of Russian aggression. Vladimir Putin's rhetoric throughout the interview with Tucker Carlson is a masterclass in historical revisionism and strategic manipulation. He frames Russia as a victim of Western expansion, distorts the nature of Ukraine's sovereignty, and justifies aggression through a selective and misleading interpretation of history. Putin's fixation on historical borders, especially his claim that Ukraine is an artificial state, reveals a primitive and outdated view of geopolitics, where modern nation-states are seen as extensions of ancient empires, rather than sovereign entities with their own identities and rights. This perspective ignores the evolution of international law and the principle of self-determination, which have shaped the modern world. Putin's narrative is designed to justify Russia's actions by invoking a romanticized and often false version of history. He uses this to legitimize aggression and undermine the West's support for Ukraine. However, the West's response, rooted in defending international norms and the sovereignty of nations, stands in stark contrast to Putin's revisionist approach. The West's actions are not about encroaching on Russia, but about upholding a rules-based international order where countries are free from external coercion and influence. In essence, Putin's thinking is rooted in a dangerous and outdated worldview, where power and borders are determined by historical claims rather than the consent of the governed. This approach is not only primitive, but also destabilizing, as it disregards the modern principles of statehood, democracy, and international cooperation. The West, in contrast, operates on the understanding that stability and peace are best maintained through respect for sovereignty, law, and the self-determined will of nations, making its stance not just legitimate but essential in today's world.